Which brings us to the case of Senator John Kennedy. For a second Sunday in a row, Joe, the Louisiana Republican argued that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 U.S. elections. In a contentious interview on Meet the Press yesterday, moderator Chuck Todd asked Kennedy about a Washington Post op-ed from columnist Michael Gerson, which criticized Kennedy's comments last week that Ukraine was responsible for the DNC hack.
Simply uttering this conflation on Ukraine and Russia, the inference is you're doing the president's dirty work here. Do you accept that criticism?
Well, listen, I like Michael Gerson. I haven't met him, but I know he's a smart guy, and I read his columns now and again. I disagree with him. I think both Russia and Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election. I think it's been well documented in the Financial Times, in Politico, in The Economist, in the Washington Examiner, even on CBS.
According to the New York Times a couple weeks ago, U.S. senators were briefed after Fiona Hill's testimony that actually this entire effort to frame Ukraine for the Russian meddling of 2016, of which you just made this case that they've done it, that actually this is an effort of Russia propaganda, that this is a Russian intelligence propaganda campaign in order to get people like you to say these things about Ukraine. They're trying to frame Ukraine. You apparently were briefed about this in the United States Senate by intelligence officials. Are you at all concerned you're doing Russian intelligence work here?
I was not briefed. Russia was very aggressive, and they're much more sophisticated. But the fact that Russia was so aggressive does not exclude the fact that President Poroshenko actively worked for Secretary Clinton. Now, if I'm wrong, and if all these journalists are wrong,
I mean, my goodness, wait a minute, Senator Kennedy, you now have the president of Ukraine saying he actively worked for the Democratic nominee for president. I mean, now come on. I mean, I got to put up, you realize the only other person selling this argument outside the United States is this man, Vladimir Putin. This is what he said on November 20th. Thank God nobody is accusing us anymore of interfering in U.S. elections. Now they're accusing Ukraine. Well, let them sort this out among themselves. You just accused a former president of Ukraine. You've done exactly what the Russian operation is trying to get American politicians to do. Are you at all concerned that you've been duped?
No, because you just read the articles.
Ed Luce, it's telling again. This is a guy, I'm sorry, this is a guy who went to Oxford, who's well-educated, who knows better. He knows the United States Senate was warned several months ago not to push this Russian propaganda. Again, Donald Trump's intel agency, not any sort of deep state. That rose out of the ground, and yet he's blaming the Financial Times, John Kennedy. He's saying that the Financial Times actually is the one that if you just read the Financial Times, then you'll understand why the 17 U.S. intel agencies and the intel briefers that went to the Senate are wrong. That Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election. Maybe since you write for the Financial Times, you can clarify for us.
Well, first of all, going to Oxford is no defense. I should remind you, Boris Johnson went to Oxford. But I've been racking my brains, as have colleagues, as to which Financial Times reporting Senator Kennedy's referring to in support of this, really fanciful contention that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 elections. And I can't find it. I don't know whether he did the same with the Washington Examiner and The Economist and so forth. But it seems like he just plucked those newspaper names out of thin air because there is
so you
no
you and the you and editors of the Financial Times can find no article that suggests that Russia and Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election.
We can find plenty that show Russia intervened in the 2016 election, but not that Ukraine did. We've done a lot of reporting, as others have, on the oligarchic scene in Ukraine, which is very murky and it's a corrupt country. But the idea that Ukraine intervened in the U.S. 2016 election specifically is not something that Senator Kennedy can point to the Financial Times as supporting. And I'm not too aware of any credible reporting on that subject. I think Fiona Hill was absolutely right when she said this is a conspiracy theory, an alternative reality that was cooked up in the Kremlin. And there's, from farm to fork is now coming out of Senator Kennedy's mouth.
Wow.
Ed, how striking is it for you, Ed Luce, to watch a United States senator actually parrot Putin's talking points and doing exactly what the intel community warned him and warned other senators against doing? What does that say about where we are on Monday of the week that we are moving forward on the impeachment of the American president? That this is the Republicans' best defense?
I have to say it's profoundly dispiriting in a sort of geopolitical sense that not just, a senator, but an entire party, for the most part, that controls one half of Congress plus the White House, is parroting a complete, a sort of moon-barking conspiracy theory about the 2016 election. That's very alarming. But at another level, unsurprising, because as Jonathan and you were pointing out, this is an impeachment process where there are very, very few defenses of the president's actions. We began with that partial transcript, and from then on, which was pretty much clear in terms of the quid pro quo implicitly on offer there. And from then on, we've had, 17 or so witnesses just bolstering the view that that was a quid pro quo. So what is it that they can attack? They can attack the process, which they're trying to do by refusing to cooperate. And they can just try and throw enough dust in our eyes so that we get confused and think, oh, Russia, Ukraine, well, they're all pretty much the same, and each side's as bad as each other. And it seems to be working with their base, and that's why I don't think at the moment people are predicting there's going to be any Republican defections when it comes to the Senate trial.
So, Reverend Al, let's expand beyond the Republican Party and just talk about Republicans, registered Republicans. What does it say about a party that for 50 years claimed to believe, like I believe, that the long twilight struggle against the Soviet Union was extraordinarily important, and that the wall coming down in 1989 and democracy spreading across Europe was one of the great days of our lives? What does it say that this party now not only embraces a president, but backs a president's and a party's defense of this extortion, this rigging of the presidency in 2020, as well as the embrace of Vladimir Putin's talking points? Politicians before Trump would have had their careers destroyed on a Sunday afternoon if they had repeated the lies that Senator Kennedy repeated yesterday on Meet the Press.
It says that they are really being tricked and conned by a Manhattan con man, Donald Trump. The fact is, one of the things that concerned me this weekend as tourists came to New York to see Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building and celebrate Jonathan's 40th birthday, that they be careful of people not far from Trump Towers that engage in three-card Monte, where they take your money by having you looking at the wrong card for what stone or whatever they put under the card. And this is what we saw, Joe, on the talk shows yesterday by Republican leaders. They are discussing whether Ukraine was involved in supporting Hillary Clinton, which is not what is in front of the Congress and the Senate. What is in front of the Congress and Senate is whether the President of the United States, Donald Trump, withheld military aid to get them to announce some smearing of his opponent. We're not even in front of the Senate, in front of all of what happened in 2016. Nothing happened in terms of Ukraine and Hillary Clinton. But even if it had, that's not what we're looking at. But in the three-card Monte game, you get them to look at the other card so you can get away with their money. And that's what he's doing. He's having us discuss something that is not before the Intelligence Committee, not before the Judiciary Committee. Look at the other card so I can steal your money. The subject this week, Mr. Trump, is whether you withheld U.S. Congress-sanctioned aid to Ukraine, who was under threat under Russia, to smear Joe Biden through smearing his son. That's the issue. All of this fantasy about Hillary and about Ukraine and all of that has nothing to do with the proceedings in front of us, and the public ought not be robbed on Times Square a mile from your house by playing to the wrong card. There's nothing under that card. The stone is under the card where you got on the phone and tried to get the president of Ukraine to smear your potential opponent. Let's stay focused here.
But Nick Confessori, it's a willing con. The victims are willfully being conned. They want to be conned. These victims actually, in a poll that a lot of people were talking about this weekend, it's the Republican Party, members of the Republican Party say that Donald Trump is a better president than Abraham Lincoln. The president who saved the Union versus the president who has run up the biggest debt in U.S. history, the president who has capitulated to Kim Jong-un, the president who time and time again has put his interests ahead of the interests of the country. I mean, it's just one poll. It's just one snapshot in time. But I can also show you other polls that show that rank-and-file Republicans' approval of Vladimir Putin rose exponentially after Donald Trump became president of the United States. And in some of those polls, Republicans have better opinions of Vladimir Putin than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama.
Well, Joe, what we're seeing here is actually an outgrowth of a long-term trend in American politics. And what's fascinating with the GOP here is that they are borrowing Putin's conspiracy theory, but also his tactics. There's a book out of Russia about life under Putin's Russia. It's called Anything is Possible and Nothing is True. And that is life in Russia, where everything is conspiracy theories and murk. And the only faith that can be had is in Putin, in his strongman kind of leadership. And I think, in a strange way, what we see in that poll is what's happening in American politics, is that the only important principle is fealty and strength. It's not really about the issues or trade or even immigration on some days. It's really about showing the people like us on this set that there isn't anything we can say or do or bring to light that matters. The only thing that matters is staying loyal to the president, from the Senate to the House on down.
You know, but Mika, this begs a question. Again, we understand who Donald Trump is. The entire world now knows who Donald Trump is. They know that he's capable of absolutely anything and will do absolutely anything that he's allowed to do. He believes that Article 2 gives him unprecedented power. He has said it publicly.
Yeah.
He would do there. You cannot imagine a scenario that Donald Trump would not engage in,
Right.
if he were allowed to get away with it. So we know that. But is it asking too much for one Republican senator to speak out against Russian propaganda being spouted by a colleague? Is it too much to ask Ben Sasse to take to the floor today and speak out against Russian propaganda being pushed by members of his party? Is it too much to ask Mitt Romney? I mean, Mitt Romney has all the money he will ever need. Mitt Romney has all the money he will ever need. He can get reelected for as long as he wants to get reelected. Is it asking too much for Mitt Romney to go to the Senate floor today and condemn colleagues who are using active Russian measures to push Vladimir Putin's propaganda on Sunday talk shows without remorse, without apology? Is it asking too much for Mitt Romney or Ben Sass or Susan Collins or Cory Gardner or Martha McSally or Joni Ernst or any Republican? I'll take any Republican senator to say, it's just not right for us to actually promote Vladimir Putin's propaganda policies when we go on national television. It's just we cannot be that party. Is that too much? Apparently it is, Mika. Not one Republican senator, not one, will speak out against this. Not one.
Fair to say it's their job, and they're not doing their job.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.